The world was still young when Adam and Eve began their life outside the garden. The air felt different, heavier somehow, and the ground beneath their feet no longer gave freely as it once had. Yet, in the midst of hardship, hope began to grow in their hearts. One day, Eve gave birth to her first son. Holding the child close, she smiled through her tears and said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Adam looked at the child with wonder and replied softly, "We will call him Cain." The baby cried loudly, full of life, and in that moment, their sorrow seemed to lift just a little. They held him as a promise that life would continue, even beyond the loss of Eden. Some time later, Eve gave birth again, this time to another son. She held the child gently and said, "His name shall be Abel." Cain, now older, watched his younger brother with curious eyes. As the boys grew, their personalities began to show. Cain became strong and determined, often working hard with his hands. Abel, on the other hand, was quiet and thoughtful with a gentle spirit. Adam would sometimes watch them and say to Eve, "They are different, yet both are gifts from God." Eve would nod and reply, "Yes, each has been given a path of his own." The family lived simply, learning each day how to survive in a world that no longer came easily. As the years passed, the boys took on responsibilities. Cain worked the soil, planting seeds and tending the ground. Each day, he would rise early, his hands already thinking about the work ahead. "The earth is stubborn," Cain would say one morning, wiping sweat from his brow. Adam nodded and replied, "It is because of the curse, my son, but with patience it will yield." Meanwhile, Abel became a keeper of sheep. He spent his days guiding the flock, watching over them with care. One evening, as the sun set, Abel said softly, "The sheep listen when I call them. They trust me." Eve smiled and said, "Then care for them well, for they are also under God's watch." In time, both brothers came to understand that they should honor the Lord with what they had. One day, Cain gathered some of the fruits of the ground he had worked so hard to produce. "I will bring this to the Lord," he said, looking at his offering. Abel, too, prepared something to give. He chose the best of his flock, the firstborn and the finest portions. As he examined them, he whispered, "Only the best should be given to God." Cain watched him and said, "An offering is an offering. The work itself should be enough." Abel looked at his brother and replied gently, "Perhaps it is not just the work, but the heart behind it." The two brothers walked together, each carrying what they had chosen to present before the Lord. When the time came, they presented their offerings. Abel stood quietly, placing his sacrifice with care and reverence. Cain laid down the fruits of the soil he had gathered. For a moment, there was silence. Then something unexpected happened. The Lord looked with favor upon Abel and his offering, but upon Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Cain's face fell, his expression darkening with confusion and anger. "Why?" Cain muttered under his breath. Abel, sensing the tension, said softly, "Brother, what troubles you?" Cain clenched his fist and replied, "I have worked just as hard. Why should it be accepted and not mine?" The silence that followed was heavy, and something dangerous began to stir within Cain's heart. The Lord saw the change in Cain's face and the storm growing within him. In the quiet of that moment, God spoke to him, not with anger, but with warning. "Cain," he said, "why are you angry? Why is your face fallen?" Cain stood still, his jaw tight, but he did not answer. The Lord continued, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" Cain's eyes shifted, uncertain. "But if you do not do what is right," God warned, "sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Cain heard the words clearly, yet inside him, resentment began to take root. Instead of softening his heart, he let the warning echo into silence. Later that day, Cain found Abel out in the field, watching over the sheep. The wind moved gently through grass, and everything seemed calm. Cain approached slowly, his thoughts heavy and unsettled. "Abel," he called out, his voice steady but distant. Abel turned and smiled. "Brother, come sit with me," he said kindly. Cain looked around and then said, "Let's go out to the field together." Abel nodded without hesitation. trusting his brother completely. As they walked side by side, Abel spoke lightly about the flock, but Cain remained quiet. His mind was not on the conversation. Something darker was growing inside him, something he had chosen not to resist. When they reached a quiet place, far from the sight of others, Cain stopped walking. Abel turned to him, confused. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Cain's expression had changed. His eyes were hard, his face tense. Without warning, Cain rose up against his brother. Abel barely had time to react. "Cain, what are you doing?" he cried out in shock. But Cain did not stop. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, he struck Abel down. The field fell silent. The sheep scattered in fear, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Abel lay still upon the ground, his life taken by the very one who should have protected him. For a long moment, Cain stood over his brother, breathing heavily. The anger that had filled him just moments before began to fade, replaced by a terrible realization. He looked at his hands and stepped back slowly. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. The silence around him felt overwhelming. There was no voice, no answer, only the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He tried to compose himself, but something had changed forever. The ground beneath him, which he had worked so hard to cultivate, had now received his brother's blood. And though no one else was there, Cain knew deep within that he could not hide what had happened. Then the Lord spoke again, his voice breaking through the silence. "Cain," he said, "where is your brother Abel?" Cain froze. For a moment, he considered the truth, but instead, he chose another path. "I do not know," he replied coldly. "Am I my brother's keeper?" There was defiance in his voice, but also fear. The Lord answered, "What have you done?" Cain's eyes widened as the truth was spoken aloud. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The word struck him deeply. The secret he thought he could hide was already known. There was no escaping it, no covering it. The earth itself had become a witness against him. The Lord's voice grew firm, filled with both justice and sorrow. "Now you are under a curse," he said, driven from ground, "which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Cain's heart pounded as he listened. "When you work the ground," the Lord continued, "it will no longer yield its crops for you." Cain lowered his head, his strength fading. "You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." The words settled heavily upon him. The land he had trusted, the soil he had worked, would now resist him. Everything familiar was slipping away, and the weight of his actions could not be undone. Cain's fear began to rise, overwhelming his anger. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he cried out. "Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence." His voice trembled as he continued. "I will be a restless wanderer, and whoever finds me will kill me." For the first time, Cain seemed to fully grasp the consequences of what he had done. The strength he once carried was replaced with dread. He realized that the world outside his home was uncertain and dangerous, and now he would have to face it alone. But even in judgment, the Lord showed mercy. "Not so," God said. "Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord placed a mark on Cain, a sign of protection, though also a reminder of his guilt. Cain felt its presence, though he did not fully understand it. It was both a covering and a burden. The Lord had not allowed him to be destroyed. Yet his life would never be the same. Justice had been spoken, but mercy had not been withheld. Cain turned away from the presence of the Lord, his steps uncertain. The place that had once been his home no longer felt like it belonged to him. Eve wept when she realized what had happened. "Our son, both of them," she whispered through tears. Adam stood in silence, his grief too deep for words. The loss of Abel was painful beyond measure, but the loss of Cain, though he still lived, felt just as heavy. One son was gone forever, and the other was now far from them, marked by a terrible choice. Cain traveled east, away from everything he had known. The land stretched wide before him, unfamiliar and harsh. Each step reminded him of the life he had left behind. "I am alone," he said quietly to himself. The memory of Abel's voice echoed in his mind, gentle and kind. Cain shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they returned again and again. Regret followed him like a shadow, and though he continued to walk, he could not escape the weight within his heart. Cain eventually settled in a land called Land of Nod, east of Eden, far from the place where his family had once lived together. The name itself seemed to echo his condition, a life of wandering. Yet even there, life continued. Cain took a wife, and in time, she gave birth to a son. Holding the child, Cain said, "His name shall be Enoch." For a moment, something within him softened. "Perhaps," he whispered, "life can still be built." The pain of his past did not disappear, but he began to focus on what lay ahead. Though marked and burdened, Cain chose to keep moving forward. Cain began to build a city and named it after his son, Enoch. The work gave him purpose, something to occupy his hands and mind. "We will not wander forever," he told his family. "We will build something that lasts." The city slowly took shape, walls, homes, and places for gathering. It stood as a sign of human effort and determination. Yet deep within Cain, there remained a quiet unrest. Though he built with his hands, he could not rebuild what had been broken in his heart. Still, life continued, and his family grew. Generations passed, and Cain's descendants began to spread across the land. Among them were people who developed new skills and ways of living. One became a keeper of livestock, another learned to play instruments, and another worked with metal, shaping tools, and weapons. Human life was advancing, growing more complex with each generation. Yet alongside this progress, something else also grew: violence and pride. One of Cain's descendants, a man named Lamech, spoke boldly to his wives. "I have killed a man for wounding me," he declared. "If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. His words revealed how far the human heart had drifted. Back in the place where Adam and Eve lived, grief still lingered. The memory of Abel remained fresh, a reminder of both love and loss. One evening, Eve sat quietly and said, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel." In time, she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. Adam held the child and said gently, "A new beginning has been given to us." Though nothing could replace Abel, Seth brought hope into their lives once more. The family, though broken, was not without healing. As Seth grew, something different began to emerge among his line. People started to call upon the name of the Lord again. There was a turning of hearts, a desire to seek God despite the brokenness of the world. One man said to another, "We must not forget the ways of the Lord." And another replied, "Yes, for without him we are lost." It was a small beginning, but it marked a shift. Even in a world where sin had spread, there were still those who chose to seek what was right. The story of Cain and Abel did not fade with time. Instead, it echoed through generations as a warning. Parents would sit with their children and say, "Remember what happened between the brothers." One child asked, "Why did Cain do it?" The father would pause and reply, "Because he allowed anger to grow instead of stopping it." The lesson was simple, yet heavy. Sin does not begin with actions. It begins in the heart, and if left unchecked, it can lead to destruction. The story became more than history. It became a mirror for every human heart. In quiet moments, people reflect on Abel's life. "He gave his best," someone would say thoughtfully. Another would respond, "And his heart was right before God." Abel's offering was remembered not just for what he gave, but for how he gave it. His faith became an example, even though his life was short. It is not about what we bring, an elder would explain, but how we bring it. The memory of Abel lived on, not in buildings or cities, but in the understanding that God sees beyond the surface. Cain's story, however, carried a different weight. Travelers would sometimes speak of a man marked by God, wandering the earth. He built cities, one would say, but never found peace. Another would add, he tried to move forward, but the past followed him. His life became a reminder that choices have consequences that cannot always be undone. Yet even in his story, there was something else: mercy. God did not destroy him, someone would point out. He gave him time. And in that, people saw that justice and mercy often walk side by side. As generations continued, the contrast between the paths of Cain and Seth became clearer. One path moved further into pride and self-reliance, while the other leaned toward seeking God. Which path will you choose? A mother would ask her son. He would look up and say, the one that leads to life, the question remained for every generation, not just for them. Each person had to decide how they would live, whether they would allow their hearts to harden or choose to walk in humility before God. And so, the story of Cain and Abel stands as one of the earliest and most powerful lessons in human history. It speaks of jealousy, anger, and the danger of unchecked sin. But it also speaks of faith, choice, and the possibility of redemption. You must rule over it, the Lord had said to Cain, and those words still echo today. In every heart, there is a struggle between what is right and what is easy. The story reminds all who hear it that while sin may crouch at the door, each person still has a choice to turn toward what is good. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the Golden Bible Story page on YouTube, follow on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. God bless you.